So thank you again for coming, and I'll give the floor to Professor De Puma.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to be back here in Tampa. This is my third visit, but the first one is so long ago, I can't even remember what year it was. But I was giving a whole series of lectures in Florida, different universities and different museums. And I know it was in your old building, that I'm definitely sure of. But it's wonderful to be back. And it's great to be in a new facility that shows every bit of excitement and promise that I'm sure you've all been anticipating. So let me talk about the Etruscans a bit, and excuse my voice, I am not exactly in the best health right now. But I think you'll be able to understand. A few years ago, there was an interesting website that developed, and it was a survey. And in this survey, it was clearly an informal survey. It asked women to talk to their significant men in their lives. It could be their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, their boyfriends, anybody who was a man. And the question they wanted them to ask is, how often do you think about the ancient Romans? And I thought, well, that's an interesting question. I wonder what it would turn up. Well, later on, I started to read the results of the survey. It was surprising to me because a lot of men actually did think about the ancient Romans. And when they asked what they thought about them, several were popular expressions of thought. One was Roman numerals. Most men who were interested at all in the ancient Romans knew something about Roman numerals. They could recognize them, and sometimes they knew X equals 10 and B equals 5 and so forth. But most of the time they had trouble interpreting large numbers like a year, like 1546 or something like that. It looked too complicated. But at least they knew about that. And the reason they probably knew about Roman numerals was because for a long time, Roman numerals have been used, especially in our culture, for official things. Like, remember, all movies used to have a copyright at the beginning of the film, and it would show you the date in Roman numerals. And another thing, sporting events, big events like the Olympic Games have Roman numerals, or the various football Super Bowls and so forth. So that was an understandable reason that they might understand Roman numerals, or at least the concept. A second thing that was very much on the minds of many men about the ancient Roman world was gladiators. And you can see the popularity of that too. It's an aggressive sport, it could lead to death in many cases. It's very exciting. Hollywood loved it. And there are many films, in fact, even brand new films like Gladiator 2 that just came out last year, before the survey was done, by the way, but they had already seen Gladiator 1, I'm sure. So that and movies like Spartacus, very popular films. So people knew quite a bit about gladiatorial combat. A third thing that they knew something about was Roman architecture, and especially engineering skills, like the building of the Colosseum or the building of aqueducts that brought water from great distances to bath complexes in various cities. And the Romans were famous for building all of that stuff and making it work really well. They also built one of the best road systems the world has ever seen. Even today, in some ways, it rivals ours. So those were all good reasons why the men and the lives of all these women might have thought about Roman antiquity. I was curious to know what the survey results would be if they had said, how often does the man in your life think about the ancient Etruscans? And I think that most of the men, even the ones who knew those answers about the Romans, might have just drawn a blank. The Etruscans are very little known compared to the Romans, and yet all of the things I just described about ancient Rome, guess what? They're all Etruscan. They all have their origins in Etruscan culture. Most people don't know that. They automatically think, well, this is all Roman. But even the Romans would have admitted to us, if we could talk to them, that these are Etruscan things. The Romans adopted the system of Roman numerals, we should put it in quotes now, called Etruscan numerals, from the Etruscans. Gladiatorial combats, that sounds so Roman to us, but it was actually original with the Etruscans. In fact, they had their best schools in Capua, and that's exactly where the Romans had their best schools too. So that same city, yeah, thank you. So that was colonized by the Etruscans. And the same thing is true for the engineering techniques, and especially the hydraulic systems. The Etruscans were very, very good hydraulic engineers, and they built some of the most incredible things that most people just had never seen or heard about. So without going into any more details, and I could talk about this all day long, obviously, I just want you to be aware of that fact. And it's an important thing to keep in mind. We also might consider, why is this true? Certainly Hollywood, I've already mentioned, that's a big factor, I think, in making it true. If Cecil B. DeMille had decided to do a movie on the Etruscans, this would probably have changed everything, but that didn't happen. And there are some movies about the Etruscans, but very few compared to the sword and sandal movies that had a long, long history in Hollywood and around the world too. Some of the first movies that the Italians made, even in the silent period, were actually about ancient Rome and about Pompeii. Just what you'd think. In other words, Pompeii overshadows almost everything. And it's because it's so immediate and we can understand it so well. And it is obviously important. And I don't mean to denigrate these other cultures. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just trying to explain why we have this slanted view of the past. Another big factor, and I know from looking at your audience today, that many of you, like me, when we went to school, especially in public schools, but also in private schools, when we were in grade school and in early middle school, we probably learned Latin. Latin was the language that was taught in almost every American high school. There was a time when that happened, and many of us are old enough to remember it. That is no longer true. In fact, we don't even teach English in lots of schools. So it's a very big change. And I first learned about the Etruscans as a schoolboy because I was studying Latin. And fortunately, my Latin teacher at that time knew a little bit about the Etruscans, and at least we learned a few basic facts about them. So that's another big factor. We're also not in Europe. Europeans, and especially the Italians, obviously are more connected and feel more connected to the Etruscans. And so they know about them. A lot of Italians, even sort of ordinary Italians, can talk about the Etruscans, and many modern Italians think they're related to the Etruscans and can look back in their own family history, especially if they come from Tuscany, that they might have Etruscan ancestors. So those things have all made a big difference in American versus European culture, and also in the time differences. So I want to talk a bit about the Etruscans today, just to give you a general idea of who they were and why we should continue to study them. Oh, and before I forget, one thing I wanted to mention, and I know Branko has already talked about this to many of you, but we have Etruscan News. I think there's still some left on the table at the back. It's a publication, and there are 2 years there. So if they're still around, be sure that you get both copies because they are different and they look sort of alike because it's a magazine, but they are different. The earlier one is from last year, which was our 25th anniversary year. And we were very excited to produce that because I can't tell you how many people at the time told me, oh, this will never last. Nobody's interested in the Etruscans. So we proved that that's wrong. We at least lasted 25 years. And there's actually 26 years because the other copy that's there is from this year. And we have every hope of producing another maybe 25 years or 50 years, who knows. No, so let's look at the Etruscans. The map here is of Italy, and it shows you most of the peninsula. And you can see the Etruscans are in the shaded area. Their primary homeland is, and because of their name, this is what we call it, Tuscany. It's roughly the area between the Tiber River and the Arno River, the Tiber running through Rome, the Arno running through Florence. So that's an easy way for Americans to think about the area. But actually, the Etruscans, of course, settled beyond that area. That was their homeland, and that's where we see their origins. But they quickly started to colonize other areas, both in the north and in the south and in the east. And so the map tries to show that, but it's actually out of date. When the map was made, it was pretty accurate, but actually the areas that are shaded, that sort of ochre color, both north and south, are bigger than they look on this map. So the Etruscans settled in the Po River Valley, and they had a really brilliant civilization there. It's largely underestimated today because only in the last maybe 40 years or so have there been really good systematic excavations of that area. And one of the major cities was Bologna, and it's very difficult to excavate in a modern city. You can't tell people, oh, we're going to destroy your building so that we can excavate here. It doesn't work, certainly not in Italy. So there have only been sporadic investigations in the major part of, in the centro, in the major part of Bologna, but there have been lots of peripheral areas that were excavated. In fact, I'll mention one of them in a moment. And the same thing is true in the south. We know the Etruscans colonized that whole area. And there's every indication that the more people look, the more they find. And in Italy, it's almost like every time you see something being dug up. For instance, one of my best friends in Italy was, for a long time, one of the inspectors. In other words, if you were digging something and you found something that was ancient, whether it was Etruscan or Roman, you had to report it. And that's a law in Italy. You had to report. And then they send out an expert who looks at the stuff and says, okay, you can finish building your garage. This is not important material. Or they might say, wow, this is fabulous. It's an unknown Etruscan cemetery that you just happened to discover. And so we're going to stop you from building anything else here. And we're going to assign a team of archaeologists to excavate. This happened a few years ago. This happened to a friend of mine who was working in the south, not too far from Pompeii. And they wanted to build a new supermarket, a big supermarket. So they started to excavate. And what they found was a whole pre-Etruscan community of farmers. It was sort of like an expanded farm, almost like a plantation, where there were several small farms. And so they had to stop immediately. And the supermarket was never built there, it was built somewhere else. And that turned into an archaeological park, and it enhanced the local museum with an amazing series of finds. That site was destroyed by an earlier eruption of Mount Vesuvius, not the one that we're all familiar with that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. So you can see, I said, almost any time you take a shovel and start to dig in Italy, you're going to find something. And sometimes it can be very important and totally unexpected. And other times it might not be that way. This is an insulin pump. I'm sorry. It's just wanting to me to do something. And I will put it to sleep, I hope. It's not serious. So if we move on, the earliest Etruscan material is what we call Villanovan. That's because it was first identified at a site called Villanova. And that happens to be a site not in Pennsylvania, but in the Po River Valley area, not too far. It's a suburb of Bologna. In the 19th century, a gentleman, he was an aristocrat, an amateur archaeologist, his name is Gozzadini. He happened to be digging around in his fields, and they found evidence of an early tomb. And as they explored more, they realized it was part of a big cemetery. And the kind of pottery that came out of that cemetery is what you see on the slide here. It's a very typical type, and you've got an example of it too. It's what we call a biconical urnum. It's made of clay, but it's not very well levigated clay. It's not refined clay. It's rough clay. So it has all kinds of impurities in it. It can have sand and straw and stuff like that. So it's not something that you would throw on a wheel because it would damage your hands. Instead, it's hand built with coils or slabs of clay and then fired. These were used for cremations. People who lived in that area at that time. And this is, as you can see, it's early. The earliest material comes before this. The earliest material is from about 1000 BC. So this is a couple hundred years later. But it's very similar to the ones that were found earlier. They tend to just get a little bit more refined as time goes on. So the ashes were placed in one of these urns, and then a lid was put on top. In this case, the lid is actually a bowl that's just been inverted. But in other cases, the lid is a helmet, and it can be either made of clay or bronze. This one's made of bronze. Obviously, the ones that are made of clay were never used as real helmets. They're sort of symbolic helmets. This also led Gozzadini and other people to identify the sex of the cremated person, something that you can't tell from the ashes, of course. And so it was assumed that the bowl was generally used to hold the ashes of a female cremation, and the helmet would have been for a man. But not every man was a warrior. And so there are some that could be with the bowl as well as with the helmet. In fact, it may be that the helmet also designated a status in the society rather than just a profession. You can see that as time went on, more and more things were added to the tomb. They become richer and richer. At first, it's just the ashes in a container. That's it. But later, they start to bury things that the person might have used in his or her life. For men, for instance, you can see that this man took a sword with a scabbard and some spear points and javelin points. There's also a razor. That's the lunar-shaped thing on the bottom row of objects. And there's also jewelry of different sorts. And that's, of course, what you would find with variations in female burials as well. So people are becoming more wealthy, at least some people, and they can bury their dead with more elaborate things. In fact, some of these helmets become very interesting. This one is a different type of helmet that has a finial with little figures on top. Most of the containers from the Middle Roman period are made of clay. It's only wealthy people who can afford to have bronze. So bronze is always going to be more expensive. It's interesting that and I should mention a little bit about bronze because it's such an important thing in the Etruscan period. The Etruscans just happen to be located in an area that has all the things you need to make bronze. It has very good supply of copper ore and tin. Tin is not something you find all over the Mediterranean. In fact, people were always desperate to find tin so they could make bronze, because the two major things that the alloy of bronze consists of is copper and tin, and lead is another one. But copper and tin are the major ones. And they happen to have them. They happen to just happen, it just happens that their land is rich in those elements. That was a natural resource, and it made them rich. They also had some gold deposits early on, and they happened to be sitting on some of the best land west of the Valley Nile, as people would say in some of our famous plays. So the land meant that they could become terrific farmers. In fact, Chianti is still famous for its farms, even today. We still drink their wonderful wine and so forth. So these are not surprising things. They continue even to this day. But it made the Etruscans very, very wealthy. And it made them, of course, because they became wealthy, it made them interested in art and collecting art and importing elegant, exotic things. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. Not everybody was buried in ashrams of the type we've just looked at. Some people were buried, their ashes were buried in what we call a hut urn because it looks like a little hut. And you can see this one is made of clay, almost like 99.999% of the ones that have survived are made of clay. There's only one authentic bronze version. There are some bronze versions that are probably pastiches, like the one at the Met. And there are some that are fakes. So it's very rare to have a bronze hut urn. The one that is from Vulci is in the Villa Giulia in Rome. We're hoping that they'll send it to us for that San Francisco show, but it's only a possibility right now. I hope it'll come here. It would be the first time it would be displayed in America. These hut urns are important. They were primarily used in the southern part of Etruscan territory, in what the Romans call Latium, what we call Lazio today. So that's the area basically around Rome. And one reason they're so important is that they actually duplicate on a small scale the actual huts that people have excavated. So we know this is a reflection of kind of structure they lived in. And what it is showing you is that in both cases, both the biconical urns and the hut urns, the Villanovans were interested in trying to replicate either a body itself, that's why the helmet would come in so well, to replace the body that was lost, or a house that the soul of the person could live in. We don't know, for instance, for a fact, we don't know that the Villanovans believed in a soul, but they probably did, because they obviously think that there's something that they have to prepare for, and that being cremated, being turned into ashes, doesn't mean the end of you. Your spirit or something had to have a place to live. And so this is what they did. You can see in this diagram the way those different types of vessels could be accommodated in a cemetery. Basically, they're digging a deep hole and they're putting the ash urn at the bottom. Then they're filling it in with other tomb gifts, and they often put rocks around that, and they build a kind of roof over it, and then fill it with dirt. In some of them, like the third one over from the left, they bury the funerary containers, the ashes, in a big stone container with a lid. So that really is ultimate protection. And others, you can see they have a big clay pot that they put everything into. Then everything is covered over, and up on the ground level, they probably, it doesn't show that in this picture because we're not sure about it, but they probably built a rough stone lid over all that, a kind of marker with stones, and they could have just collected stones without shaping them or doing anything elaborate to them. Some people, however, especially in the northern area around Bologna, started to make what look like tombstones. And they begin what becomes an elaborate tradition of very interesting tombstones. Unfortunately, because Italy had all this rich ground that I talked about a minute ago, there was always lots of farming going on. And so you can imagine people with plows just rolling over all the studs and collecting them and putting them aside, building a fence with them or something like that. So the identity of the place where the tomb was is gone, is lost, unless somebody plows it up and or accidentally stumbles upon it, which of course does happen all the time. Sometimes, in fact, a man with a plow being led by a horse or an ox will plow into a tomb, break the roof, and go inside. That happened in 1828 at Vulci, when a farmer almost died, and he and his horse found themselves inside an Etruscan tomb because they had broken through the roof. It was a subterranean tomb. that was on the property of Lucian Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, the Prince of Canino at the time. And it led to, the important thing is, it led to excavation of the whole cemetery. And soon enough, his wife was appearing at parties wearing regal Etruscan jewelry. And that caused another sensation because other women wanted to have Etruscan jewelry too. So they did more excavations. And then it even caused the Castellani family, a family of jewelers, to make imitation Etruscan jewelry so that they could satisfy that need. So you can see there's like a snowball effect, an accidental discovery that led to an enormous series of excavations of a very important site. Bulci was one of the major Etruscan cities. It's also unfortunate that it happened at the time it did because the archaeologists were very sloppy and they weren't interested in much of anything except gold and painted pottery. So they often actually destroyed pottery they thought was worthless. George Dennis talks about this. He visited Bulci at one point in the 19th century, shortly after the first discoveries, and he was watching the foreman who had been appointed, the Prince Lucian Bonaparte, to excavate the tomb. And his helpers would hand him different things that they had found, and he'd look at it. It looks like a vase. It's nice. It's got pictures of people on it. We'll keep that. Oh, this is just a plain black vase. Not very interesting. Sad. George Dennis watched that for maybe 10 minutes, and he said the man was smashing every piece of buccal pottery. And he said, if you're going to just destroy it, would you mind? I would like to have one. Could I have one? And the man was holding one that George Dennis thought looked interesting. And he said, no, and he smashed it. So that just shows you how crazy all of this was at a time that was very important. Getting back to the Villanovas, one of the last of the iconic gardens is a very interesting one now in Florence from Monte Scudaio. And you can see that this one is the first one to show really something more than just geometric design. On the lid, you can see that there's a man seated at a banquet, and a servant is perhaps bringing or holding a fan. It's not completely preserved, so it's hard for us to identify everything that's going on. But it shows you the importance of banqueting, and that was one of the aspects that the later Etruscans too see as part of the future for them. Their afterlife is very different from our idea of heaven and hell. Their afterlife was more like heaven all the time. They mostly enjoyed banqueting and hunting and fishing and swimming. Sometimes they're shown doing a few other things that are a little bit more like work, but not much. We rarely see tortured or harmed in any way. And there's a growing number of scholars today who think that most of the Etruscan concept of the afterlife consists primarily of banqueting. There you can see this guy. He looks like he's having a hamburger. And the big vessel on the right is probably full of wine, so he can drink. There were other things there. You can see the places where they were originally, but they've been broken off. So we don't know if there was another vessel there or another person standing there. Now, this map It's actually even less accurate than the earlier one, but it gives you an idea of what became of the Etruscans as they grew in wealth. They became great traders. They had good local products to trade. They had the ores that you needed for bronze production. They also had all kinds of farming and wine production. Most people today think that wine in the French, in the south of France, is because of Roman importations of grapevines and so forth. It's actually because of the Etruscan wine imports. The wineries established in the south of France were established by Etruscans, not by Romans. And that's been definitely shown, improved by studies of the seeds, the roots, and I don't know what all. One of the most active parts of one of the most active parts of Etruscan studies right now is about plants, and especially about wine and wine production. And you can read about that, and I think it's in the earlier of the two Etruscan names, because I did a book review on a very interesting book that is a series of articles about this very topic and about what the Etruscans ate and how they got their food, what they did with it, and so forth. So wine is a big part of that. The book is edited by Lisa Ferracini, one of my colleagues working on the show in San Francisco. She teaches at Berkeley. Anyway, so that's why there are these brown arrows going through southern France and up into the center. And the brown arrows show you where the Etruscans were and where they traded to the north. And we find Etruscan material all the way into Sweden. So we know that they didn't necessarily travel there, or they could have, but their products were going that far north. The same is true for the Greeks. You can see that the Greeks, represented by a green color, were also very active traders and colonizers. What this map doesn't show, and is, I don't know why they left it out, but they left out Africa as an area of trade, so that no arrows going to Africa. But of course, the Greeks not only colonized Africa in various places, like the colony in Egypt itself, and certainly across the parts that we call Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia now. And the Etruscans did too. They traded with the Phoenicians, who were the major colonizers in that area. And the Phoenicians were great traders, and they were very closely connected with the Etruscans. I'll mention that again later with some other objects. So we start to see things that are definite imports to Italy from foreign countries and places. This is one of the most important. It's a vase that was made in Egypt, and it can be dated accurately because it represents Bogarus, who was one of the pharaohs of Egypt, and we know exactly when he ruled. So the vase was probably made around 700 BC, and it was traded with the Etruscans. We don't know what they traded it for, maybe copper ore or something like that we don't have anymore. This is at Tarquinia, and it was found in an Etruscan tomb that's very rich and has a lot of imported items. And you also find imported things like these ivory handles for fans. And that means, of course, that they were importing ivory itself, either raw ivory. There are no elephants living in Italy. So they had to import this from the Near East or Egypt. We don't know in every instance, we can't tell in every instance whether it was the raw ivory that was then turned into a product by Etruscan artists, or whether the whole thing was made, whether the whole thing was made abroad and sent completely finished to the Etruscans. Both things are quite possible, and you can see it's difficult to tell. In this case, it's likely that those were made in the ancient Near East because the material is foreign, but also the designs are very typical of Near Eastern designs. However, the Etruscans quickly started to copy Near Eastern designs. So you can't say every time you see a Sphinx on a work of art, it means that it was made in a foreign land. It could be that they just happened to like sphinxes in Etruria as well. The same thing happens today. We make copies of all kinds of things that don't really exist here. And you can see these can be sometimes very elaborate. This is a cylindrical box made of an ivory tusk that has been shaped and then carved row upon row of figures. The whole idea of having registers of processional figures, whether they're animals, fantastic animals, or people, is very typical of Near Eastern art at this period. In fact, we call it the Orientalizing period. One of the other things that was imported by the Etruscans is the alphabet. The Etruscans didn't know how to write until they met up with Greeks. The Greeks had already learned how to write earlier. By the way, writing spreads across the world from different sources. And in this case, it ultimately goes back to the Near East, we think, or Egypt. There's still an argument about who was actually first. But in both cases, they're earlier than the Greeks or the Romans or the Etruscans. The Etruscans learned how to write a Greek alphabet from the Euboean Greeks who had settled, who had formed a colony at Pithecusae. It's an island, it's a site on the island of Ischia in the Gulf of Naples. The Greeks had, in fact, Naples itself, we call it Naples. The Italians call it Napoli. And Napoli comes from the Greek word Neapolis, which literally means new town, new city. There are lots of towns in America that are called new towns. So you can see what a common name, there's one in Iowa, in fact, not too far from Des Moines, which has a French name. But anyway, that's why their alphabet is a little different from the Attic Greek alphabet or the Laconian Greek alphabet and so forth, because the alphabets were a little different in different parts of ancient Greece. So it's just an accident they happened to come in contact first with the Euboeans. And somebody must have said, wow, what is that stuff you're making these little signs with? And they said, oh, these are symbols for sounds. You can use that to write words. And they must have thought, what a brilliant idea. We can use that. And they did, of course. One thing you can notice on this tablet right away is that the alphabet is running from the right side to the left. It's going the wrong way. You might have thought, oh, he put the slide in backwards. No, it's actually the way they wrote. Usually. Now, sometimes they write what we would call the correct way. It's our way. And sometimes they're like the Greeks who write what's called boustrophodon. I don't have an example of boustrophodon, but it goes like this, back and forth.
like you're plowing.
It means, yeah, boustrophodon in Greek means when the ox plows. So the ox plows from one side of the field, then goes back on the other side. You don't lift up the ox and take him over to the other side like we used to do with typewriters. So, yeah, so it's a different process. Here's a very nice piece in the Metropolitan, and it shows the alphabet going the correct way. They think this was an inkwell. And here's another one that's very interesting, because this shows not only an alphabet, but a syllabary. A syllabary is where you take each consonant in the alphabet and pair it with each vowel. So you would say ba, bi, be, bu, ka, ki, ke, ku. Go A, E, I, O, U in our language, and put that with each of the consonants to form a sound. It's something that people do when they're learning how to write. And the person who owned this happens to have been a woman. And it shows you something else that's very interesting about the Etruscans. Unlike the Greeks and the ancient Romans, women seem to have had more opportunities in the Etruscan culture than they do in those other two. The Greeks often say things like, the less you hear from a woman, the better she is. They don't have anything to do with this. The Romans are not much better. It's all like J.D. Vance. So in this case, we know that Etruscan women could actually read. They were more educated in that regard than their sisters in ancient Greece or Rome. And that's a very interesting thing to know about. That's another lecture, but we aren't going to do that now. So here you can see that being spelled out for you with the different sounds. Some interesting writing discoveries were made, especially in 1964, with the discovery of 3 gold tablets at Pyrgi. So the Pyrgi tablets look like this. And they are, 2 of them are in Etruscan, one of them is in Phoenician. We knew a lot about reading Phoenician. We didn't know as much about reading Etruscan. So this was at first thought as it might be like another Rosetta Stone, but they're not precise translations. They're more loose translations. So it's not quite like the Rosetta Stone, but it still helped a lot. One of the biggest problems with the Etruscans, and one reason we don't know as much about them as we'd like, is that we still have trouble reading Etruscan. And that's because it's not because they didn't write or didn't produce a lot of writing. We know they did because some of their works are mentioned by later authors. So we know that there were Etruscan playwrights, there were Etruscan historians, Etruscan poets, all the things you guessed that would exist. The trouble is, we don't have that material. It wasn't preserved. A lot of it was destroyed on purpose, and a lot of it was destroyed because it was often written on perishable materials. The Etruscans primarily wrote by painting onto linen. They had linen books that were folded, and only one of those survives. It's not complete, a good surviving elements. It's the longest Etruscan inscription. I'll show you some others in a minute. For instance, here you can see a lengthy Etruscan inscription on the sarcophagus. The man is holding a scroll. And if you look at the scroll closely, you can see that it has an inscription, and there's a translation of it. He was related ultimately to the Greek. There were lots of Greeks who did move to Italy. I think that they realized, well, there's several reasons for that. I won't go into them now, but there were wars and famines and all kinds of disruptions. Italy was a safe haven. And so it was also a place where there was a good deal of wealth. And so the artisans and architects and so on knew there was a market for them and they could get jobs. Here's the lengthy inscription I mentioned. It was turned, it was reused, it was recycled and became a mummy wrapping in Egypt. But it's actually an Etruscan mummy wrapping. The Etruscans never mummified, by the way. So, but their linen came in handy and it was recycled in Egypt. And this particular inscription is a kind of manual for what should be sacrificed to a particular god when a particular thing happens for each day of the year. So it says things like, on September 21st, if it rains, you should sacrifice to the goddess Hera, and you should sacrifice a lamb. Okay. It says, on May 3rd, if there's thunder and lightning, it means that the women, I'm sorry, the slaves are going to revolt, or there's going to be a war. So there are all kinds of predictions that are made for specific events on specific days. You saw some early examples of pottery. Here's a later example. By this time, this is in the 7th century. By this time, the Etruscans have invented a very refined kind of pottery called bucro. And this is the kind of pottery that I described a minute ago, that was being broken by the man who thought it wasn't very beautiful. But you can see it's actually quite elegant and it can be very, very beautiful. The clay is very refined. It's fired in a reduction kiln, so there's no oxygen or very little oxygen. And it turns the fabric completely black. Even if you break this, it will be black on the inside as well as on the outside. That's a sign that it's true growth. And different kinds of stamps or designs can be impressed into it. The Etruscans made bucro in all sorts of shapes. Some of the shapes are copies of elegant ivory produced material, like this tripod goblet. Sometimes they're copies of bronze pieces. One of the most important shapes that starts very early, and this is an Etruscan invention, is what's called a spiral amphora. Here you see two bucro examples. We don't know why they use spirals so often on them. That shape was modified as time went on. It became taller, thinner, more elegant, with wider handles and a taller base, like this. You can see it's a very different shape now, but it's got the basic form. It also is painted with figures, and that's because this wasn't made in Italy. It was made by a Greek artist, and we know his name. He even signed his name on this. I don't know if you want to point it out, but it's right just below the, yeah, right there. Nicosthenes Epoiasin. Nicosthenes made this. Nicosthenes owned a workshop in Greece, that specialized in making pottery that would be sold to the Etruscans. His market was the Etruscans. And so he's making shapes that he knows they like. And this is one of the shapes they like a lot. Here's an interesting kind of asher that is designed to look like the body of a person. The people in Chiusi, this area, northern part of Tuscany, always seem to have preferred cremation. Other places started using inhumation more often. But throughout Italy, you can find both things at every period. And we don't know why that happened in Chiusi, but they tended to do this when other people were switching to inhumation. And actually, not everybody in Chiusi followed that rule, but most people did. These canopograms are really very interesting. About 130 or 40 exist right now. One of the things that's most fascinating about them is that they can be modified to suit particular individuals. So you can see the head here has holes in it. That's because you can put a beard on it, or hair, or you can put eyes that are different, whatever. It's almost like Mr. Potato Head, you remember that toy, where you could change his features and things. So it's an adaptive process, very interesting. And you can see they also use real jewelry. By the way, Etruscan men wore earrings as well as women, so it's not a sex identifier. Sometimes they're made of bronze. Often they sit on little thrones. And not too long ago, and you can see this if you go to Bologna, in one of the museums there was a tomb that was found with this kind of cremation urn, and it not only has the body of the person in bronze, but he's dressed. He has a hat, he has a leather sort of vest and a cape, and he even has a footstool with little feet that are separately made and little booties on his feet. So he took everything with him. We are moving here to the south of Etruscan territory at Civetri, where there is a huge cemetery. I'll bet you some people here have been to Civetri. Has anybody? Yes. Cari is called the ancient name for the place, but Civetri is about 30 miles north of Rome, a little bit to the west. And it's famous for its enormous cemetery. There are over 3,000, I think it's around 3,500 tombs that have been discovered so far. And they're tombs that are built into tumuli. A tumulus is like a big mound of earth, artificial mound. And so there could be like 5 or 6 tombs into that. Inside, they're designed to look, they're carved out of stone completely, but they look like houses on the inside with columns and beds for the deceased. Here, this tomb would have contained 1, 2, 3, 4 people on this that I can see there with their beds. So they were laid out to rest. No embalming, no mummification, and they would have been dressed in the clothes they wanted to take with them. The tombs at Tarquinia are multiple as well, but they usually have paintings. The ones at Civetri don't have as many paintings. These are very impressive tombs. And you can see here are 2 death demons preserved on the painted walls at the entrance to this tomb. And recently, this tomb was discovered just a few years ago. You can see banqueters on the left, an older and younger man banqueting on the funerary couch, and then some of the different monsters. Here's a chariot that's going to the underworld. And this tomb was discovered when a road was being widened near Tarquinia. The Etruscans had a very different attitude about temples, temple architecture. The Greeks made their temples primarily out of stone, especially marble. About the only thing that wasn't stone, most Greek temples, but not all, was the terracotta roof. The Etruscans are just the opposite. They used stone for the foundations and the steps you can see at the bottom here, looking sort of gray. Everything else is either mud, brick, or wood, and then lots of terracotta on the roof. They liked to put multiple statues on the rooftops, and sometimes they're very elaborate subjects. Here's the fragmentary one that shows Apollo. And this one is a famous one too, a prophet. It reminds one of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. Oh, that's made of marble, of course. And the horses are very famous at Tarquinia. Everybody likes those. You can see that even animals wore Etruscan jewelry. The horses have necklaces. I mentioned that not everybody at QZ was cremated. Here's an example of an inhumation burial. And this woman was very elaborately shown as decked out, wearing her best clothes, lots of jewelry, and looking at herself in a mirror. She's holding a compact. Ashes became more like sarcophagi too. So here are two examples for ashes of the deceased, in this case, both men. And you can see that the subject matter is identical on both of these. And that's typical too. There tends to be a kind of generalization, multiple copies and copies and copies of the same kinds of ornaments, whether it's for a man or a woman. Sometimes it's very hard for us to understand why something was selected for a particular burial. I want to show you these two examples because they're in this country, they're in Boston. And they're both, they're the lids, the total sarcophagi survive, but I'm showing you here only the lids. And they both came from Dulce. In fact, they came from the Prince of Cuneios property and were found in the 19th century. They were offered to people, they were for sale, and nobody wanted to buy them in Boston. They were actually shown at one of the Boston expositions. I forgot what year it was, like 1840, something like that, very early. And people in Boston were too puritanical for something that looked like that. So they didn't, the people who tried to sell them could not do that. But ultimately, they ended up in Boston. It's a long story. Anyway, the one on the left is the father and mother of the man on the right. So it's two generations. And the man on the right, their son, married, of course, another person from a different family, and that's his wife. They're interesting because they show not only Etruscan customs, but American customs in the 19th century. Today, if these were offered for sale, there would be a lot of people who would want to buy them. They're very important. They're the best, in my opinion, they're the best Etruscan sculptures in North America. But it was very, very hard to get them to be put on display in Boston. I'm not going to be able to talk about Etruscan mirrors. It's one of my specialties. So I've done whole semester long boring seminars in Etruscan mirrors. But today I just wanted you to see one so that you know what they're like. They're made of bronze primarily. There are a few silver ones. They might have made them in gold too, but we don't have any gold examples. We do have a few surviving silver examples. And there are several silver fake examples because people knew that was rare. And they thought, oh, well, this will sell on the market. So they made bad imitations. But this one is definitely authentic. It was excavated at Toby. And you can see that it's bronze. The reflecting side is the opposite side, so you can't see your image on this now. But on the back of it is what's interesting to us, and that's because it shows engravings that are very complicated, often very interesting. The engravings here show the story of the judgment of Paris, and the figures are even labeled so that we can read their names in Etruscan. And if you look at the detail, you can see that very clearly. So there's Turan, and you can see her name is written backward. It's in a little box to the right of her head, Turan. That's the same as Venus or Aphrodite. So we have three names for her. Her name in Greek is Aphrodite. Her name in Latin is Venus. We probably know her best. It's Venus. Her name in Etruscan, which you probably haven't heard before, is Turan. And all the figures are mentioned here. Some of the engraved material, even if it's not mirrored, is very impressive. By the way, there are about almost 4,000 Etruscan mirrors that still exist. So it's a big area of study. And there are about 100, maybe 110 cisti. That's a toiletries box made of bronze with a lid. This is the most famous one. The Figueroa, it belonged to this man. That's in the Villa Giulia. And it has interesting inscriptions too. So you can see how elaborate it is. And look at the handle. It shows Fuflins. That's the Etruscan name for Dionysus or Bacchus, the god of wine. Fuflins, flanked by two satyrs. As time goes on, the Etruscans become very interested in Hellenistic art, and there's a very strong influence from Greece. And you can see that in paintings like this at Tarquinia that show a typon, a man, a person who has a body of a man, but wings and snakes for his legs. And you can see that it compares very nicely with the altar of Zeus at Pergamon, now in Berlin. By the Roman period, of course, the Romans slowly pick off the Etruscans and eventually conquer them completely. But they're never really exterminated. They're absorbed by Roman culture. For a long time, the Romans were educated, wealthy Romans were educated in Etruscan culture. And many, as I said at the beginning, many features of Roman culture were inherited from and improved in some cases by the Romans. So late Etruscan art starts to look very, very much like what we think of as Roman art. This is a good example of that. By that period, what was left of the Etruscan civilization, the Etruscan people had become Roman citizens. They were granted Roman citizenship around 83 BC. If you're interested and wanted to read more about the Etruscans, here are 4 things that I want to make you aware of, because all of these books are available now, and they're very good and very interesting. The first one is by the late Sybil Haynes, who was a close friend of mine, taught at Oxford, and her book on Etruscan civilization was done by the Getty, so it's very well illustrated and it's very up to date, at least for 25 years now. The second book is an edited volume by another close friend of mine, somebody I was in graduate school with, and that consists of a series of about 50 different chapters written by different people. And all of us were experts who wrote on our special thing. I did 2 chapters in that book. One is on mirrors and one is on Bucro. So those are both really nice things to know about. The third book is one that I wrote for the Met. And I'm not advertising it here because I get a royalty. I don't get a royalty. In fact, I was paid upfront to do the job. So no matter how many copies are sold, I don't get any more money. So I wanted you to be aware of that, because if you're thinking he's hyping his own book, I'm hyping it because it's really a great book. It really is.
It's available as a free download.
Yeah, I know. That was not a decision I made. But it's a very good book. And it was a very wonderful experience to write it and to work with the people there at the museum. So it has fabulous photographs, of course. And several pieces I showed you today are included in that book. The last one is another edited volume by one of my students and one of my colleagues. So there's always a connection. We're a close family because there aren't that many of us working in this field. But that's one of the nicest things about it. And it's very good to see on those days when I taught and somebody would say, do we have to know this? Do we have to read this? One person actually, I had told a wonderful anecdote about something that happened to me in Rome that year. And this kid said, would that be on our test? It's wonderful to see after that experience that some of my students are serious, became very successful professors themselves. And that's the joy. That's the good thing about teaching. I won't tell you about the bad things. Thank you very much.
I think we can all agree that that was a very immersive lecture. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Some of you may want to go upstairs. I will be there to talk a little bit about the exhibition that we have. There may still be copies of the newspaper, the Etruscan News, at the store. There may be a few copies in the gallery, but they're flying out the door like hotcakes. Some of you may have to leave. The time is already way past 3. But if you have questions for Professor De Puma, I see Flip and Phil. Go ahead.
So I have actually two questions. The first is you've spoken a lot about the Etruscan relationship to Rome, to the Greeks, but it appears they did a lot of trade and so forth with folks in Sicily, the Greeks and the Italians in Sicily. Can you speak more to that issue, or is that everything we know?
So trade relations beyond Rome and Greece.
Yeah, there's a great deal of trade, and it hits almost every port you can imagine. In fact, not too long ago, about 3 years ago, one of my friends discovered an Etruscan cemetery in Sardinia, and that was not known before. We knew that they traded with Sardinia, but nobody knew that they actually were living there and dying there and being buried there. So that's a very important kind of thing. And that has happened numerous times earlier with the Sicilians, for instance. So yeah, I think as modern people who are used to taking jet planes anywhere, we think, oh, we're the only ones who can really travel. We can go anywhere in the world, and that's true, we can. It may not always be pleasant, but we can do it. They traveled a great deal more than you think. Considering that they didn't have anything close to the speed with which we can fly somewhere, they still got around an enormous part of the world. So all over the Mediterranean, I'm sure it wouldn't surprise anybody if we find an Etruscan cemetery someday in Denmark, for instance. It could happen.
My second question is, you referenced the grapes in France looking like coming from, have they done any genetics to actually see that they took plants there?
So the answer is yes. The research that has been done on French grapes has proven that they are connected to grapes coming from Italy, from the region where the Etruscans lived.
I'm done with French wine now.
Yeah.
Is there any particular reason, like geographic or cultural reason, for cremation or inhumation?
Or the reasons why cremation or inhumation might have been preferred.
Yeah, we really don't know. I mean, that's the short answer to that. There are various theories at different times. Some people think that it had a lot to do with prestige and wealth, because you can certainly have a bigger container. If you have a sarcophagus, you can fill it with lots of stuff. Whereas if you have a small container, you don't have as much space. But the actual preference is very difficult. I might point out that the same thing is true today. If you ask people, are you going to be cremated or buried? There's often, a lot of different answers as to what they prefer. And it does not necessarily have to do with their religious beliefs. So it's a complicated question.
There are too many questions that we can answer, but that's a good thing.
What you show in Europe is the judgment of Paris on it. Did they get their belief system from the Greeks? I mean, was they believe in the Greek Olympic gods?
If their religious beliefs were taken over from the Greeks, or if we know anything about their original religious beliefs.
Looking at the map, they're a lot closer to North Africa than they are to Greece, but it looks like their art.
There's certainly a great deal of similarity in the mythical beliefs of the two cultures as far as the identification of different gods. So we've already seen today, I've told you the names of in 3 cultures of the same god, but that doesn't mean that all the aspects of that god are the same, nor does it mean that all the ways that are represented are the same. For instance, the Etruscans had a goddess who was like Athena, and they called her Nerfa, which is almost like Minerva, which is what the Romans called her. But in the Etruscan culture, she does all kinds of things that she doesn't do in either Greece or Rome. And she's even shown differently. She's shown with wings, for instance, as if she's like an angel. And she's not shown with wings in either Greece or Rome. So that's a very complicated question. And it's a very interesting one. Yeah, I used to have, I'm not doing it anymore, but I had a lecture about that actually. It's a very interesting topic. And I would point out several of those books talk about questions that relate to that.
But they're difficult to answer
Yeah.
if they need religious texts to explain their belief system. So we will have one more question for Michelle, and then for all of you who want to go upstairs to the gallery, let's continue the conversation there.
Thank you. It was a fascinating lecture.
Thank
I
you.
want to thank you for it. My question relates to some of what other people said. Aeneas goes from Troy to this area. Is there any connection time-wise that would help us understand Homer, when the wars took place? Do you see anything between Anatolia?
Yeah.
We don't hear the question.
Oh, it relates to
The
Homer.
question is about Aeneas, the prince who comes from Troy across North Africa, ends up in Italy, and is considered one of the founders of Roman civilization. And if there is any connection between that with actual human being migrations.
And artifacts from Anatolia to.
And their artifacts.
Uh-huh. Actually, yeah, that's a very interesting question. And it was the subject of a whole exhibition that was done in Rome in the year 2000. And there's a very impressive catalog for that. So the answer is very complicated, as you guess. I'll just mention a few highlights from it, because otherwise we'll be here till midnight. This is always the case, because the questions are a couple sentences long, but the answers are several books. So I guess that's a good sign. One of the earliest representations of Aeneas is actually on an Etruscan work of art. So we know they knew about him, and they knew that whole story. It's shown many, many times throughout their culture. So they're completely aware of that. Lavinium is the place where the Romans isolated that event. That's where he had a series of altars that have been excavated. And some of the most beautiful Etruscan terracotta sculptures come from that site. So we know that there was a strong connection with him, with that story, and with the whole sequence of artistic materials from that place. So they certainly knew about him. Now, whether that answers the other part of your question, which is what are those people connected with the Etruscans? Today, most people don't think so, but that doesn't mean they're right about it. It's the question of the origin of the Etruscans is something that has bedeviled people from the very beginning. In fact, even they didn't know where they came from. So that sort of answers your question. But there were arguments about this all through antiquity, and there are arguments today too. I've been to 3 symposia that dealt with that very topic, and guess what? All 3 of them came out with the end result being, we simply don't know, or we simply can't prove anything.
Thank you.
And I was mentioning to our sponsor before the lecture started, because we talked about DNA a little bit. In the 19th century, when people were breaking the pottery, they were also throwing out all the bones. So they didn't care. They didn't know that we were going to have DNA analysis discovered in the 20th century. So you can't blame them in this sense, but they could have had more respect for them. But even if they had touched them, it would have deposited and purified them because we leave our DNA on everything we touch. So it wouldn't have, the bones would have been contaminated even if they were preserved. We do have some skeletal material from Etruscan early excavations, but most of it was thrown out. So it doesn't solve the problem, unfortunately.
It's online, like.